Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today we're going to be talking about theological determinism, and this video is going to be the first in a two-part series where we look at arguments for theological determinism and arguments against theological determinism. Fortunately, I'm joined by an expert on the topic, Dr. Peter Furlong, a professor of philosophy at Valencia College. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Furlong.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I'll go ahead and put on the screen right now this book that you authored. In it, you explore arguments for and against theological determinism.
Yeah, sure. So the book you're talking about is mostly about the troubles, the costs of theological determinism. So we talked briefly about some reasons in the beginning why some people might accept the view, but really it's looking mostly at some difficulties it encounters. Maybe we might consider some of these to be sort of knockout arguments. Some people might, or just sort of things that you would think of as a cost of the view that would trouble people who hold the view.
All right. So I will have a link to the book in the description of this video, so you can go and click on that and check it out if you want more after this interview. So let's go ahead and begin. I thought it would be good to just define the term theological determinism here at the beginning.
Sure. So to start, I think it's best to just think about what it means for one event to be determined, and then we can sort of build our way up to a definition. And so I think it's easiest to just think about sort of an isolated event in sort of ideal circumstances or something like that. So you can imagine holding a rock and then dropping it. But imagine you freeze time as soon as you sort of open your hand up and the stone is sort of just hanging there in the air. You pause and say, okay, what's going to happen? And we say, well, we know what's going to happen. The rock is going to fall, assuming you don't catch it, assuming you don't close your hand again. It's going to fall. It's sort of guaranteed to happen by the properties of that moment, right? Sort of guarantee the next moment. Nothing's holding on to it. It still has its mass. There's still gravitational attraction. We know for sure what's going to happen, we might say, right? It's going to fall down. Sometimes people use examples of billiard balls bouncing around a table, because we can sort of set aside worries about like the friction of the table or something and just try to imagine it as pure geometry. And you can say, well, if the ball hits, at this angle, it's going to bounce off at this angle, right? We know for sure. We can sort of pause time right before it hits the bumper and say, well, what's going to happen? Well, we know what's going to happen. It's going to, reflect off the bumper based upon the angle it hits it at. In these cases, or at least imagining them as sort of perfect cases, as abstract cases, we can say, well, the moment after is determined by the previous case. What's going to happen at one moment is guaranteed to happen based upon what happened at an earlier time. And so that's what we mean to say one event is determined, right? It's guaranteed to happen based upon the properties of another moment, an earlier moment, together with maybe the laws of physics, maybe something else. Now, determinism broadly is the view that an entire class of events, we might say like maybe all moments of time, or maybe all moments of time except for the first one, because that gets weird or something, are determined. So everything that happens is itself guaranteed to have happened based upon something that happened earlier, right? So our conversation right now, what I'm saying, what you're saying, every little detail, right, down to the smallest, aspect of this event is guaranteed to happen maybe by what happened earlier today, together with the laws of physics. What happened earlier today was guaranteed to happen, and we can sort of trace our way back. Mm-hmm. I keep on talking about the laws of physics because one general way we might think of determinism, one flavor of determinism is physical determinism. This idea that earlier states of the world, together with the laws of physics, just guarantee what's going to happen afterwards. We're maybe too dumb to be able to predict what's going to happen, in the future. But according to physical determinism, it's in theory possible. We just don't have enough knowledge, either of previous states of the world or of the laws of physics, it turns out to be able to do that. But in theory, sort of, someone could with enough knowledge, right? So that's physical determinism. Divine or theological determinism says, okay, all of this stuff is still determined. It's guaranteed to happen by something earlier, something prior to it in some sense. But instead of looking directly at prior states of the world and the laws of physics, it says, no, it has something to do with God. Something to do with God's will guarantees everything else that happens, right? The entire history of the world down to the smallest moment. All of it is guaranteed by God's will, by God's divine decree or something like that. Different people who hold this view are going to sort of want to define it in slightly different ways, and in some importantly different ways, it turns out, right? There are different kind of flavors even within divine determinism. So if we want the definition then, we can say that divine determinism is a combination of the view that God determines all contingent events, we'll get to what that means in a second, and that God's will explains all of these events. This is Heath White's definition, right, roughly, and I think it's a good one. I think this is the best way of thinking about this view. And so if we want to explain why did this thing happen, we have to look back to God. And when we say, well, it was determined, that means something about God's will guaranteed that this was going to happen.
Okay. Yeah, that was clear. That's helpful. Well, with that definition in mind, then, what are some arguments for the philosophical arguments for divine determinism?
Sure. So the first one I want to talk about is sort of, you might be led to it by a combination of views. In fact, the first two we'll look at are kind of, if you hold this view and this view, put them together, it might lead you up to divine determinism. And so the first view is just assuming you're a theist already, assuming you accept some reasons for thinking God exists. Maybe they're religious, but maybe they're purely philosophical. And we have that already. And then you come to think that physical determinism is true, that the world as we know it is just governed by exceptionless laws, right, that are just built into the way the world works. And so you think, no, if we, maybe we don't know, we definitely don't know the complete laws of physics, but you think once we have that, right, together with this idea that you have a complete understanding of what happened at earlier moments, you just put those together, the entire history of the world flows out of that, right, down to the smallest detail. If you think that, and people have, many people have thought that physical determinism is true. This sort of became much more controversial within the physics community, during the 1920s, 1930s, with the rise of quantum physics, basically. But some people held on to it afterwards. Einstein sort of famously thought that, no, we were just missing something here, that the laws aren't statistical, as some physicists started thinking, but are exceptionless, right? And that we were just missing something. And there are still ways of making sense of physics, trying to take it to be an open question among physicists, whether the physical laws are exceptionless or not. And so if you already have sort of independent reasons for thinking physical determinism is true, and, whether philosophical or scientific, right? Or, and you combine that with theism, then you have this strange view all of a sudden, which says, well, no, God exists, right? And most theists are going to say, well, God's somehow responsible for the world. And I think every moment is determined by prior moments, by the laws of physics in the past. And it's possible still for you to say, well, God created the world, but something else kind of determined it, right? Maybe the laws of physics are themselves necessary, right? They're not contingent. They have to be this way. God didn't create them. They just sort of have to be this way. And sure, God maybe created the first moments or something like that, but maybe in the beginning they were indeterministic or something. I don't know, right? There's a room, but not much room. So if you're a theist and you're a physical determinist, the most natural thing for you to accept is that God was the one determining everything. The laws of physics are too, but sort of God's in the background. And so in a way, this is kind of a roundabout way of getting to divine determinism, but it's not a wildly unrealistic one. Like, as I said in the past, and many people were physical determinists, plenty still are. And so, putting these two views, not uncommon views, together will just lead you with this position. Or it makes it the most attractive position, right? There's logical.
Maybe it's the most natural fit of the two.
Yeah, exactly. There are other things you could try to say for sure, right? I don't think you're sort of logically forced into it, but it's far and away the most natural thing for you to say. If you're a theist and you're a physical determinist, it makes sense for God's will to somehow just be sort of behind everything.
Okay. So I've obviously I think you might know this. I've done several videos arguing for God's existence. I am a theist.
Mm-hmm.
So that much I would accept.
Sure.
Now, determinism, I don't think I have done a video that offers arguments for determinism. I think what I have done is I've interviewed Guillaume Bignon on compatibilism.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't recall that he did offer some scriptural reasons in that interview to think that theological determinism was true. But what philosophical arguments might be offered, or maybe it's just scientific. What arguments might be offered in favor of determinism? Because I can buy the theism part.
Yeah.
But what might someone say to try and convince me of the determinism part?
Sure. So there are different views you could sort of offer, different, cases you could make. Some of them are going to just be more deeply rooted in trying to make sense of the experimental data that comes out of the research of the physicists, right? Offering competing explanations ultimately, for the same data. And there are these various interpretations, some deterministic and some not. Putting those aside, as well outside of my expertise, we can sort of go back historically and look, why would people have thought this, right? Even people looking at sort of the physical data, but in something like the early modern period, before we get into issues in the 20th century, right? Or the 21st century for that matter. So as people started recognizing, I mean, we can go back even much further if we want, earlier than the early modern period, and even started noticing things with the Greeks and Romans, that they were noticing regularities in nature. Obviously, everyone around the world was, but we know the Greeks and Romans from their writings started thinking about this quite a bit more and wondering just how all this worked, right? Noticing that when you do certain things, other things are sort of guaranteed to happen. And then beginning to wonder, why doesn't that always happen, right? When I open my hand and the stone drops, it always drops. But other things are different, right? Like if I'm, I don't know, holding an animal and then I put the animal on the ground, sometimes it runs away and sometimes it doesn't. Why? Is it because of some difference, between the animal and the rock? Whereas one seems to be guaranteed, someone seems to be determined by what happens and one is not? Or is it just levels of complexity? And so some people started thinking, no, it's probably just levels of complexity, that we can sort of repeat the experiment we do with the stone, where I open my palm and let it drop over and over again. But every time we try to do it with an animal, right? If I'm holding a bird and then put the bird on the ground, maybe sometimes it'll fly away and sometimes it'll stay there. But maybe we're not exactly replicating in the same way. And so maybe it turns out it would act the same way. And it's just that we're not replicating it well enough. And so still you might say, well, why should anyone think that? Well, historically, people have been attracted to this idea that there must be what we might think of as full explanations, sufficient explanations, we might say, sufficient reasons for why something's happened. So if I open my hand, right, and the stone falls down, we can ask why. And historically, different people have given different answers, right? The Greeks might have pointed to something, right, their natural resting places of things. And eventually we get to this idea that no, it's massive bodies acting on each other through gravitational attraction. In any case, though, we posit this, right, as a reason. This explains it. When we get to more complicated events, things that don't seem to always act the same, why does the bird sometimes fly away and sometimes not? We still sort of want a further reason. Like, it doesn't seem satisfying to us as rational animals when we ask, like, why? And then we just say, well, sometimes it flies away and sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, but why? What changed? Like, we have this sort of push, right, in our minds to say, like, that's not enough of a reason. If you can't explain to me why sometimes one thing happens and sometimes it doesn't, then we haven't really gotten to the core of the matter. Something's missing or defective in your explanation. And I think this pushes in the background and eventually gets us to the idea of the principle of sufficient reason, which is a controversial view, and it has been historically. And basically what this says in sort of sketch form, people will fight about how it should be, properly defined, is that for every contingent event, there has to be a sufficient reason for why that event occurred. And some people will broaden this a little bit, some people will shrink it a little bit, but roughly that's what it says. So a contingent event is one that doesn't have to happen, right? We might think that some things are necessary. Maybe it's a necessary truth that 2 + 2 = 4, right? That there's no possible world out there, no parallel universe, no nothing in which 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. So maybe we think some things are necessary. Maybe even some events are necessary, maybe. But for all the rest, if you think, well, this event doesn't have to happen, right? Sometimes it's not happening. For example, maybe it didn't happen yesterday and it is happening today. There has to be some explanation. Why does this happen? Right? And this human drive to seek for explanations really is sort of essential for us in terms of the growth we've had as a species, right? It's why we always, keep rooting until we find a more and more satisfying answer. And at the base of it, right, and maybe this is true, maybe it's not, but at the base of it does seem to be this conviction that we have that behind these events, there is some sufficient reason, some sufficient explanation. Once you start pushing on this hard enough, though, this idea that there's a sufficient explanation, it seems to push into the direction that until we have the kind of explanation that shows us that, prior moments together with something like physical laws together uniquely yields one future, we haven't really explained why it happened. Instead, we just left it as a mystery, right? If we imagine sometimes I open my palm and the rock doesn't fall, and we try this over and over and over again, and it doesn't seem to be based upon what time of day I do it or how quickly I open my hand, or where I do it, what the location or the size of the rock, or which particular rock. Still, we think like we would puzzle over this and be like, why? Why does it sometimes fall and sometimes not? And we would keep pushing. And the background, sort of assumption here is something explains this. Something makes a difference before it falls, right? It can't just be everything's the same and then sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't seem like that's enough to satisfy us. Now, it might turn out that it's true. Maybe the world just is this way, right? And that's something, right, that scientists are still debating, right? Are the laws of physics, the fundamental laws that govern the universe, are they statistical or not? But the idea behind this that we can even push back earlier, right? We do seem to have this natural drive to say, you haven't explained it yet. If you haven't given me an explanation that uniquely shows why this had to happen, given what led up to it. And I think we all, at least in some sense, when we hear determinism, we're sort of put off. We're like, that can't be right. At the same time, when we think about it in terms of this idea that we want an explanation, we do want that, right? We're not satisfied. We're bewildered when, our car always makes this sound, always, right? And then we take it in and to the mechanic and it's like, it's not making this sound. We're like, why? What explains the fact that it made this sound every morning and then I bring it in and now it doesn't, right? There's something sort of that bothers us about that because deep down we seem to think there has to be something different, something that explains why sometimes it happens and sometimes doesn't. Mm-hmm. And again, as I said, if you push in certain ways on this, it seems to lead to the idea that maybe physical determinism is true. And then once early modern thinkers started understanding more and more, right? Once we have laws, being formulated, and then seemingly being able to explain lots of different things, lots of different areas, and be confirmed over and over again, or seemingly at least not falsified. It seems as if to a lot of people, we'd sort of hit on things like, okay, we've started developing things. Maybe you start with maybe Newton or something like this. And we have this really powerful explanatory tool. And then we just say, well, I think this is just it. This is what explains things. We're ignorant of the details. And maybe we're not good enough to do the full calculations, even if we knew the details. But it would all work out, right? This is the idea that gains more and more momentum, really until, as I said, the early parts of the 20th century, when strange experiments start happening in physics. But in any case, this idea that there's something like this principle of sufficient reason, that we haven't really explained something until we found that root, that reason that fully explains why it had to happen, given the prior state. We're not satisfied. We sometimes don't think we've really hit upon a full explanation. And maybe that's unfair. Maybe that's wrong. But it does seem a lot of people have thought that this was true, right? That this principle, or something very much like the principle of sufficient reason, is true. And then if they follow it long enough, they'd end up in physical determinism. Yeah. And as I said, if you're a theist, then add that to it. it seems as if we have an easy path, at least, to divine determinism.
Okay. Let me throw in a couple thoughts here real quick, and then I want to see what other paths there might be.
Yeah.
So one path toward determinism would be at least some version of the principle of sufficient reason. Now, not every version would get you there, but it seems like there would be some that, if they're probably fairly strong versions of the principle of sufficient reason, then yeah, that's going to get you there. So maybe like a much weaker version that I'm thinking that may not get you there is if you say something like, we should try to explain things as far as we can. So maybe we get to a point where something can't be explained any further. But if we can find an explanation, then that's superior. All else being equal, that would be superior to having no explanation at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's just sort of a principle of rational inquiry, and I think everyone would accept that, right? An explanation, all else being equal, at least, is more satisfying than something without it. The principle of sufficient reason is supposed to be giving something not just stronger, but different, because it's not just supposed to guide our thinking. It's actually supposed to be, whether it's beyond our knowledge or not, even hypothetical human knowledge, whatever, it's supposed to be something like a metaphysical principle that says, no, there just always is a sufficient reason. Maybe it's impossible even in principle for humans to ever find it. That very well may be. And so, yeah, I spoke about it in terms of the sort of epistemic drive for us. We have this push in terms of we want the explanations, and that pushed a lot of people into this metaphysical principle. But at the very least, I think if you stay on the level of just something like, this epistemic heuristic, yeah, explanations are better than not, that wouldn't get you near determinism yet.
Mm-hmm. The other thought I had on that point was, I know that Richard Swinburne distinguishes between full explanations and partial explanations. And so you might be able to partially explain why some contingent event occurred, but you wouldn't be able, on the way he defines it, if I recall, a full explanation makes the event inevitable. It has to occur. A partial just makes it probable. So yeah, maybe you can explain why this thing probably occurred. It was probable that this event occurred, but you, on that view, you wouldn't be able to explain why it had to occur.
Yeah, and some people want to give room even for a maybe we could say like a weaker level of explanation for why something might occur, even if it's not probable. So for example, it might be the case that if we just imagine, right, we're in imaginary land here, but we just sort of set up this toy model where we say, imagine a sort of a statistical rule, and just suppose it's actually true, right? This is actually a statistical law that says 9 times out of 10, if you perform some action, something will follow. Well, cool, you have that as a rule. When that thing happens, right, and that the more probable event happens, can you explain it? We say, yeah, look, here's this law. It tells you 9 times out of 10, this is going to happen. Great. What about when the 10% thing happens? Can you explain that? Well, it turns out it feels as if you can still point back to that same law and say, well, look, actually, this law does explain it. It doesn't explain why it's probable, but it explains why it's going to happen with some statistical frequency or something approaching this frequency, given enough trials or something like that. And so that's even weaker, right? We can explain why it might happen or why it's unlikely to happen, but following a certain sort of statistical model or something like that, it will eventually happen given enough repeats or something. And so, yeah, if you want to, give something like that, it's not as if we throw up our arms entirely and say, well, look, we have no explanation. People who are committed to this idea of the principle of sufficient reason, at least, particular versions of it, are still unlikely to be satisfied. And I think it's natural for them to be unsatisfied. And even for all of us to say, yeah, but why? What is it that makes it that like 1 time out of 10 it'll happen, but 9 times out of 10 something else will happen? And it might just be that that's the way the world is. But for all of us, I think, even if we don't ultimately accept this, hardline view of determinism, it's important to notice that there's at least kind of something of an attraction, right? Because even if we can give an explanation, we still are left somewhat unsatisfied. And maybe that's something wrong about us rather than the world. But we are driven to say, but why? Why is it that this time it turned out this way? And so, yeah, there are definitely explanations that that we can still give. I certainly wouldn't want to say, and determinists wouldn't want to say, oh, there's no explanation anymore. But maybe it's a different kind of explanation.
All right, so let's shift then to a different path. If I don't know how many you have in mind that you want to go through here, but the principle of sufficient reason would be one path toward reaching determinism.
Mm-hmm.
What else might get someone to believe or be a reason for them to believe determinism?
Yeah, sure. So now let's dive into sort of specifically ones in philosophy of religion, because the earlier ones were like, well, you take physical determinism and theism and put them together, or you take the principle of sufficient reason, at least a certain reading it, and theism and put them together. But now it's sort of jump in and look very brightly at this stuff having to do with God. And so one thing that that many theists are going to accept is that that there's something like an omni-God, right? A particular kind of God that has certain properties. Maybe all-powerful, and all-knowing. And so I want to think now about this one, what it would mean for God to be all-knowing, to be omniscient. There are different ways that people define all-knowing. Some people say, well, it means God knows everything. And some people say, well, what is everything? Well, all true propositions. God knows all true propositions. Some people want to weaken this a little bit and say, well, God knows everything that's possible for anyone to know, or something like that. But once we start fading off, it starts looking like it might not really be omniscience. Maybe it is. I don't really want to fight about that, but I want to stick with this strong idea of omniscience, that God knows of all true propositions that they're true. Once we have that, we start looking at the things in the world. How does God know, what I'm doing right now, or what I did yesterday, or even what I'm going to do tomorrow? And one move that historically has been popular is to say, well, look, God knows all this stuff, past, present, and future. And God knows the future in particular, which seems like the trickiest area, by being outside of time. So there's no worry about that causing a problem, right? Because if you have a being that's outside of time, just looking down on, on all of time, the entire timeline, God doesn't foreknow stuff. He doesn't know it ahead of time. It's meaningless to talk about things happening ahead of time, under the aspect of eternity. All fine and good, maybe, so far. But now some theists bring up another worry. And they say, look, if there's such a thing as God, right? If we build it up in this way, it's this perfect being, and then we start thinking, what would a perfect being need to look like? Well, a perfect being should be something that they call aseity, right? Or that has the property of aseity. And what that means is that this being has to be completely independent, right? Not depend upon anything else. Right? For anything. And that sounds fine, I think. And many, ordinary theists would think, not particularly philosophical theists, would say, yeah, it's fine. That sounds good. We don't make God. God makes us. But then the philosopher is going to come along and say, no, listen, God can't depend on us for anything. God can't depend on anything outside of himself for anything, including for his knowledge of what happens outside of himself. So how does God know I'm sitting here right now? Forget the future. Let's just think about the present. I'm sitting here in this chair talking with you. If there's a God and God's omniscient, then God has to know that. It'd be a pretty weak God that didn't know that. Now, historically, there have actually been people who thought that, look, God, there's a perfect being out there, but it's beneath him to know what's happening in this contingent realm. And so this didn't come up as a problem. But for most theists, look, it's not an omni-God. It's not a perfect being unless God knows what's happening. Unless God knows I'm sitting here right now. And you might say, well, look, God can tell, right? Whatever. There's some sort of divine perception by which God perceives everything that happens, right? It's not sight, it's not hearing, it's not a sense like ours, but there's some sort of perfect divine perception. The trouble with this is that every way we have, it seems, for modeling this analogy of perception is based upon how we perceive things, which depends upon the other objects, right? I see the wall because light bounces off the wall into me. And so I'm dependent on the wall. The wall has to do its job and reflect that light. Otherwise, I can't tell it's there, right? I hear, a squirrel scurry up a tree. Why? Because the squirrel moves and causes sound, and the sound reverberates through the air into my ear, whatever. Like, we can tell this long story, but key in this story is that the object of perception is doing something. And for every kind of perception that we can even imagine, it seems, right? At least if we're giving any real content to what we're doing, it seems as if the object being perceived has to do something. It plays a pivotal role. The trouble is, as soon as you say that for God, you've lost aseity. Because now God is dependent, deeply dependent, it turns out, for all of this knowledge on creation. Right? Maybe God exists without having to worry about us. That's fine. Like, God, we're not making God or something like that. But now for this whole realm of divine knowledge, which theists tend to take pretty seriously. Like, omniscience tends to be a big deal. This is a prime characteristic. It's not a tiny little thing you want to say about God. It's a big deal. Why is God perfect? Well, one of the things is he knows everything. Cool. How does he get that knowledge? We give it to him. That's a problem, right? I mean, maybe give it to him is a bit much, but if he's dependent on us for it, then all of a sudden it starts looking like this deeply dependent being, at least by the lights of many theists. And so historically, they might start talking about, knowledge, even foreknowledge. And it's easy to get into this idea that, like, well, it's the knowledge of the future that's causing the problem. But it's actually not, right? This worry with aseity is about knowledge at all. How does God know I'm sitting here? How does God know when someone prays to him? How does God know humans even exist? And unless you're going to take this very unpopular view historically, but some people have had it historically, that God just doesn't know contingent stuff, then all of a sudden we have a bit of a problem. Now, there are ways around this, right? Without going the full divine determinism way. And we can talk about, one popular version of that historically if you want, but I just want to show how this easily connects up with divine determinism. So once you have this idea that God is omniscient and God is fully independent, right? God is ase, including his knowledge. Then you have to say, well, where does his knowledge come from? And the most obvious way of connecting the dots is to say, well, God knows what happens here because God created every detail of this world according to his own plan. So he just knows his plan and knows that he's causing stuff according to his plan. And he knows that he's always perfect in carrying out his plan. And so it's all self-knowledge, right? God can know I'm sitting here. How? Not by looking down at me from heaven or something like that, but because God knows he's causing me, right? It's divine self-knowledge by which he knows everything.
Yeah, can I chime in real quick there?
Absolutely.
This is a clever argument. My immediate thought is what God knows is that he plans that event, but he wouldn't know that the event exists. Like, the event isn't actual. I guess I should say that. He doesn't know the event is actual until it's actual. But then at that point, you're stuck with something outside of God. Does that objection make sense?
So
he can totally know that he plans to do that and that he's powerful enough to do it. He can know that. But he can't know that it's actual until it's actual. But once it's actual, it's too late. Like, he depends on it being actual.
Yeah. So here's the reply that these people would give. They would say, look, it's not as if God plans it and then knows it's gonna eventually happen, but doesn't know when. God knows. I mean, first of all, we can just talk about God's eternity. So from God looking at it in eternity, there's no when it happens. As soon as God decides to does it, well, then there's this space out, there's this time which God does not exist in. And there's no sense in saying, like, when does the timeline come into existence? Right? That seems to be, they would say, a category mistake. Once you're in time, you can ask, well, when is it going to happen? But from the aspect of eternity, there is no like, oh, it wasn't there and now it is there. It's just there. And on top of that, it would be part of God's plan to know sort of when to implement things in time. And so God could just know, I caused it. I caused the universe to come into existence, the entire timeline, or whatever, right? Maybe it's playing out, but it's playing out in time. God would be outside of time or something like that. And so even the question of what is happening right now might turn out to be meaningless once we put God outside of time. We could ask God, like, hey, what time is it? This is sort of a worry. It plays with issues in time, which we can get into if we want, but it takes us a little bit away from some of the things we're talking about right now. We'll actually get to some of this with creation in a few minutes, talking about another reason people like this idea. But it might turn out that, like, it doesn't make sense to ask, like, God, like, what time is it right now? Well, for me, it's this time. For God, it's eternity, and God just sort of, created this timeline. And as soon as God knows, not just like I have a plan, but is it implemented? But like, no, I've created the world. And if we take seriously this idea that God's doing that from eternity, it's not this idea like God's sitting around and waiting, being like, is it time? Is it time? Should I create now? Is it time? Right? Like, you want to say, well, that's not quite the model. Like, that's the way our imagination thinks of it. But it's not really what eternity is supposed to be, right? It's not just supposed to be an infinite timeline, but it's supposed to be a way of sort of stepping outside of time, right? A timeless possession of complete existence, including in which God doesn't change. And so this is important for thinking about God's knowledge. Traditionally, philosophical theists have accepted this view that God doesn't change. No feature of God changes over time. And so God's knowledge can't change either. So it can't be like, well, I knew my plan, but now I know it's actual. In fact, from all eternity, God's knowledge has to somehow be the same, or at least it seems that way, given this idea that God can't change. Again, some people are going to want to play with that, either reject it outright or say, well, no, we accept it, but knowledge is weird, and things have to be toyed with there. At any rate, though, they would still be happy to say, look, God doesn't know reality by looking at it and seeing that it's actual. God knows something is actual because he knows he made it actual, and that's self-knowledge. And the only worry there...
Well, my worry then might be this. We defined omniscience as knowing all true propositions, but it is a true proposition that such and such is actual, right? So God needs to know that if we're sticking with that definition, he needs to know that it's actual.
Yeah.
It's not... Now, that proposition that it is actual may be entailed by this other proposition that he caused it.
Yeah.
So he can know that other proposition, I caused this.
Yeah.
And he can know I planned this, and he can know I'm powerful enough. But if he's omniscient, he's got to know that it's actual. That doesn't seem like just self-knowledge.
So here's one thing we could say, and I think you've already said it. Like, he can know that he caused it, and he could know that if he causes it, it's actual. Once you put those two things together, all you need is a little logic to know for sure it's actual.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It can be entailed by those two propositions. That's fine.
And most of their knowledge comes through. I mean, we might not want to say like God knows things through entailments exactly. Most theists wouldn't want to say like God's knowledge is discursive or something like this. But you don't want to say that knowledge by entailment's not knowledge, do you? Because most of our knowledge is through entailment.
No. I would totally agree. I guess I'm trying to get at between self-knowledge and, I guess, something that isn't self-knowledge. So not self-knowledge. How about that?
Yeah.
So we exhaust the options. Gosh, it seems like it's not enough to only know, because we're dealing with different propositions. Like, he's got to know all true propositions.
Or no, I mean, some people say he must know of all true propositions that they're true.
Right.
And so any sentence you can give, you want to say, well, it's actual that I'm sitting here right now. This model can say, yep, God knows that. How does God know it? Because God made me sit here right now. That's, in fact, that seems to be the best way of knowing things. We know things through their causes.
Okay. Well, maybe that's the difference. You said something, how does God know it? And that God knows it are maybe two different. Yeah, I would want to say those are two different things, right? And so you might say, how he knows this through self-knowledge. Oh, okay, maybe that's what's getting it, is if he knows it through his own self-knowledge, or like knowledge of himself, something about himself, then now he's no longer dependent on the thing. I see. Okay, I think that was the link I was missing. I see.
Yeah, and so we might worry, and this might be at the root of your worry, that like it's not enough for God to know everything. He's also somehow like be directly acquainted with things, rather than knowing them in what might seem like an imperfect way through an implication or something like that. It might seem like he knows it secondhand or something.
Yeah.
So I think
But I wouldn't want to say that. I mean, that my line of questioning was maybe assuming that, but
yeah.
once you pointed out, I'm like, I don't think I want to say that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so historically, this has been at least a big motivation for some, theist philosophers to say, like, no, they wouldn't want to call it divine determinism, but they might end up with looking like something that just is divine determinism, pushing this way, this line that we really need to make sure that God preserves aseity.
Mm-hmm. One last, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take up too
Yeah,
much
no.
time, but it's an interesting argument, and it's the first time I've really thought you've pointed this out to me. So one other thing might be this is when you say God caused such and such, that one is interesting because so God has knowledge, like I caused this,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe this is where the root, maybe like my worry shifts from the conclusion of that little syllogism to one of the premises instead. Like, well, how does God know that premise that He caused that? Now that one, I don't know. It seems like at some point it would be meaningless if you to say I caused such and such, but there's no effect.
Mm-hmm.
If there was no, so there's got to be the thing that was caused.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so there might be a circularity worry here, right? He's assuming it's there if he's saying it caused it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that's fair. And so maybe the earlier thing we would want to say, and still we're sort of bouncing around with propositions, and some of the theists I have in mind would be worried about even saying, right? They wouldn't even want to talk about like God's knowledge of propositions exactly. That maybe, anthropomorphizes God too much and all that. But we'll stick with this model. It's at least a way we have of talking about it. And so maybe we could push back and just say something like, God willed the existence of this thing. Now, we can will the existence of things without them coming into existence. And so willing for us is not a success term, right? I willed or I wanted, to cook a good dinner, but I burned it, right? And so it doesn't seem to have this problem that cause has, where it presupposes that the thing, came out, that the object, right, is already there. And for God, I could just know, like, look, I willed this thing to exist. My willing is sort of always successful, right? There's no possibility of my willing something failing to succeed. And so I know the thing exists.
Okay.
Something like that. People are going to be worried. And whenever we start talking about this stuff, especially as we get deeper into talking about like the mind of God or something, all the philosophers I'm thinking of are going to want to back off and be like, look, this is analogous language. We're doing the best we can with human metaphors. This isn't literally what's going on, but we can at least start reasoning in some sense about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've seen two paths so far. I guess one was put theism and determinism together, and they naturally fit together, which leads to theological determinism. Mm-hmm. And the way that you get so you can use theistic arguments to get to the theism part, and you can use the principle of sufficient reason to get to the determinism part. Mm-hmm. At least that's one way that people have.
That's at least one way.
Yeah. This other way says, well, I can get you straight to theological determinism by putting together aseity and omniscience. Once we understand aseity and omniscience, it leads us straight to theological determinism.
Or at least it's the most natural path. Again, there's sort of this one popular way of trying to get around this worry historically that we haven't gone into, but determinism at least is a natural path to it. Or I'm sorry, aseity together with omniscience. At least it's a natural path into divine determinism.
Okay. So I don't know how many you have. We talked about the PSR, aseity, omniscience. About how many do you have? That'll help me gauge the time.
Yeah, so there's at least one more I want to talk about, but there's a few with extras that we could sort of throw out and be like, and here's something else people say, right?
Okay.
Different people give different reasons, and some of them are not really meant to be independent reasons, but to sort of help motivate it. Like, look, doesn't it seem like determinism really helps with this problem a little bit? But there's one more at least I want to
like to
talk
about. Let's do at least that one, and we'll see about the time.
And then we circle back. Yeah. So this one has to do with the idea of creation. And there's been, especially some recent work, I think, by Heath White on this area. And so what I'm going to say isn't exactly him, but it's especially related to what he has to say, just in a less detailed kind of way. And it says, let's start thinking about what creation means. And here's where we start thinking about time again. And one thing we could say, one thing some people have said is, look, what creation means is God sort of starts the universe off and then just sort of goes and keeps doing its thing. And some people, though, might be dissatisfied with this and say, look, that's not actually what we mean. That's not enough. When we look at God, sort of what's going on in creation, this sort of totality coming from God and creating this world, it's not enough that God just sort of gets the ball rolling, or even gets the ball rolling and then puts deterministic laws. That's still not enough. It doesn't really come to grips with what it means for something to be a creator, right, out of nothing. Instead, we should look at another model. These people say, and according to this model, we need to start thinking of the universe not as along this timeline where there was the past and there's the present, maybe it'll keep going into the future, something like that, as if it sort of unrolls, right? It's not a carpet slowly unrolling. Instead, we should think of it as something like a block. And so the entire universe, right, is sort of contained in this block. And different locations in this block, point to different periods in time, right? Some philosophers of time who have no interest in theism at all say this is actually the way we should think of time, and give arguments for this. And I think quite plausible arguments, honestly, for thinking that time should not really be thought of in this way that many people naturally do, right? As something like dominoes slowly falling down. We can ask, well, which domino is falling down right now, or the unrolling of a carpet or something like that. But it's this block with locations, temporal locations, right? We have this idea of spatial locations being, discrete from each other, but existing at the same time, right? I am where I exist, right? I'm in Orlando. I'm not sure where you are exactly, but
Kentucky,
Kentucky. So they're both equally existing, right? And they say, well, we should think about times the same way. There are different temporal locations, but both are perfectly real, and neither is more real than the other one. And it's just our temporal location that makes this period in time right now seem like the present, right? And so they're going to say, look, the word present is like the word here, right? If I say like here, I mean Orlando. When you say here, you don't mean Orlando. Well, same thing when we talk about now. If I say now and Abraham Lincoln says now, we mean different things, but neither is like privileged, right? Ontologically or metaphysically. There's no sort of answer to the question of like, well, once we sort of pull back from this framework right now, what time is it right now? Well, it's just refers to a particular temporal location within this space-time block, let's say, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that seems like the B theory of time.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's this eternalism view that, with B theory, right? So that, when we're really getting to the truth of the matter, when we talk about time, things about past, present, and future kind of fall away, and we're just left with temporal locations in an order sequence. We have before and after, but none of them are the present exactly. And so maybe you come to this view of time for theological reasons. Maybe you come to it for reasons having to do with physics. Maybe purely philosophical ones. There are actually all three, I think, are reasonable routes to come to this view of time. But especially if you have this view of time, then you ask, well, what is creation? It starts looking like what creation out of nothing should be is God creating this block, right? This block that contains everything in it. It's not a carpet unfolding and God sort of set the carpet down and like kicked it. Now, okay, everything's going to happen. We'll see what happens. We're pushing over dominoes or something. God's creating this sort of space-time block. Here it is. Every moment's already there. The details of every moment are already there, right? It's important to emphasize that with determinism. Some people think, well, maybe the general outline of my life is determined. It's like, no, determinism is like every single moment, right? Everything, every breath you've taken, every eyelash that's fallen off, like everything is sort of already guaranteed by the previous moments. And if you have this idea of like, okay, here's this, according to B theory, this eternal block, right? This is sort of past, present, future. Here it is. There's just different moments in time. Then creation of that, you want to say, well, God created the world. The obvious thing to say if you have that view of time, I'm not saying it has to be that way, but at least a natural thing to say is, well, God's creating the world is just God creating that block. But that block already contains all the moments, right? It contains everything. It contains all the details. The universe isn't like, oh, well, okay, way back at the Big Bang or whatever. But don't worry, it unfolded. Who knows what would happen? It's just everything. It's here, already sort of done and completed. And if that's our view of the universe anyway, or of time anyway, and then you bring theism to it, Or even if that wasn't your theory of time, it doesn't have to be, but you just start thinking, what does creation from nothing really look like, right? What does a robust kind of creator creation look like? You might say this is the more plausible or more attractive view, right? It's not a knockdown argument, but you just might say, well, if these are the models that we're looking at of creation, if you already independently think that there's such that creation is necessary for philosophical reasons or religious ones or whatever, and you say, cool, let's make sense of this. You might just say, well, the model on which God just sort of creates this space-time block seems the more reasonable one, or at least some people are going to be inclined to say that. That feels more of what we would say about all of creation being dependent on God. And we can sort of switch this around before we were talking about God not being dependent. But now if we look at what would it mean for all of creation to be dependent on God, this kind of looks like a strong candidate for that. But once you have that, it starts looking deterministic, because it starts looking like what God has created is an already settled complete history of the universe. That's what creation was. It wasn't creation of the first moment. It was creation of the entire sort of space-time block or whatever, right? This eternalism view of time that philosophers have, been fighting about, and that they pull from physicists as well, right? When they're looking at this, but we don't even need to go into anything having to do with whether physics supports this view or not. Some people just think this is the most philosophically attractive view, independent of theism, independent of the advances, especially over the last century, a little more than a century in physics. This would just be a philosophical plausible view of time, and then maybe theism supports it, and maybe then recent advances in physics, some people think, supports it as well. And then once you have this view of time, determinism, right? This divine determinism seems like a natural fit. Again, it's not a knockdown argument. There's still space here.
That's what I was going to ask was, so are all, it sounds like you would answer this no, but I just want to ask to be sure. All proponents, like all the people that hold this eternal block view,
mm-hmm.
Are they all determinists?
No.
Or okay.
No. So here's why. So first of all, you didn't mention whether you had theists in mind or not. But I think the answer, whether they're theists or not, is still no. It's easiest to see this if you're not a theist. So take God out of the picture and just say, well, look, this is what time is. But still, we defined determinism in terms of being guaranteed by things that happened prior to it. And so even if we have this, this eternalism block and it's all there, that doesn't mean that this moment right now was guaranteed by what happened before. It just means, in some sense, the whole history of the world is already here. But that's different from determinism. It might feel a little bit like it, but I think it has its own set of worries. And so you don't need to be a determinist for that. Now, once you bring God into the picture, I think it gets a little bit trickier. Because now, if you want to say God created, and what God created was this block, not just sort of the first slice of this block, but the whole block, still, there are going to be theists who want to say, who hold, an eternalist view of time, a theory of time, and hold that God created, everything from nothing, and will still say, well, no, but divine determinism is not true. I think, though, it's at least a natural thing for you to say if you accept this view that God created everything from nothing, and you have this view of eternalism, right? The B theory of time, where it's sort of this block. It's at least a natural idea of like, well, then what creation really was there was just the creation of that. And once you say that, it seems as if you end up with divine determinism, right? Because if God's creating that, then that's fully specified. Every detail of the history of the universe is specified in that block. And so I think you'd end up there. And so none of this forces you into it, right? I don't think we should say that any of these things, even if you accept the premises, are knockdown arguments, right? But they're suggestive. They give some weight to the idea. And for at least some people, they make it the most plausible conclusion that just divine determinism is true.
Okay. I guess a natural way to, I've tried on the other two arguments to offer a little pushback. I guess on this one, maybe a natural way to push back would be to argue against an eternal block.
Yeah, I think that's not the only way to attack this, but I think that's the most natural way. Like, most people upon hearing this will be like, that's not what time is. That's ridiculous. And yeah, I mean, I think there are independent reasons. I think there are reasons you come to from philosophy of religion, but also just from philosophical reasons absent anything to do with theism, and maybe some reasons that are sort of inspired by advances in physics, right? That would lead to this. At least when philosophers come to certain things from physicists, for example, the relativity of simultaneity. Once philosophers sort of look at that, they're like, well, this seems to imply something like the eternalism view. But there were plenty of people who pushed back against that, and so there were certainly very good people working on all of these areas saying no, these, holding out against this view of time, let alone against this view of determinism and creation and all of that.
All right. Well, to finish up, you mentioned you might have a consideration where theological determinism would help solve a problem, or more than one problem. Maybe we can fit at least one of those considerations in here.
Sure. And so I'm just going to throw one out there. This is not a sort of, it's not one that's been historically talked about a ton or anything of these other ones. Especially this idea of aseity and the idea of sufficient reason to actually have historically had a lot of weight. But just one quicker one that someone has recently argued for, and I think that's at least interesting, is the idea, this has to do with religious practice, right? Rather than sort of purely abstract philosophical reasoning. And they say, look, trust in God, right? Even putting aside all sort of specific religious commitments, right? We can sort of abstract away from, particular creeds or something. But there does seem to be this commitment to the idea that if there's a perfect being out there, that in some sense it's rational to put your trust in them. And they say, well, how would that work unless determinism is true? How would it be rational to put your trust, right? To trust in God for your future, for your family's future, for the history of this species, unless in some really weighty sense, God has control. Because if God doesn't have control, then it's kind of an odd thing to have such complete trust in this being. And the sort of more distance you put between the actual world and this idea of divine determinism, the less it seems like we should trust God. Because the less sort of control God has. And so if this idea has weight, right, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right, this idea that there should be this trust in God, the argument goes, it makes it easier to make sense of why that trust is rational. Now, it's easy, again, this is far from a knockdown argument. You say, look, you shouldn't trust in God, right? And then just work the argument backwards. Yeah, that's fine. I'm just sort of noting some ways in which divine determinism might make some things people already think a little bit easier to make sense of. And a lot of theists already think, well, it makes sense. It's rational to trust. If there's a perfect being out there, right, I should trust in it. In fact, a lot of non-theists would at least accept that conditional. If there's a perfect being, I should have some trust in that being and some trust in the way the world's going to turn out. Even if they deny that it's true that there's such a perfect being, that conditional starts making sense, right? Or at least would make sense to many of them. And here the argument goes, actually, that only really holds up if something like determinism is true. Or it holds up a lot better, at least, if divine determinism is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe my pushback on that one would be something like this. That does seem like maybe a good a priori, if that makes it like a before we can consider any like the way the world actually is.
Yeah,
that would make a lot of sense. But then once we look at all the terrible things that are going on in the world and we begin thinking that God caused all those things, I guess indirectly, but he's still like the ultimate cause of all those things, then now we might say, oh gosh, I've lost my trust.
Yeah.
But there would be replies.
Yeah, I want to make it worse for a moment. Some divine determinists are going to want to say, no, not indirectly. God directly causes all of this. Each moment, I mean, if this is creation of the timeline, it's not like God created the first moment and then look what trickled out. God created that specific horrible moment you're thinking about. And so it's much more direct in a way. I mean, we'll talk about this in the next video, I think. It makes a lot of things worse. And so one thing some people say is the exact opposite of what I just mentioned. They say, no, it makes this issue of trust way worse. Right. And so there could absolutely be pushback where some people are going to say this helps the issue of trust. And some people are going to say, nah, this makes it much worse, for something very much like the reasons you're giving.
All right. Well, we just hit the 1 hour mark. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there, though. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. and I'm sure I could keep talking to you for another hour if we didn't have to go to sleep.
Yeah,
So thank you so much, Dr. Furlong, for joining
thank
me.
you.
I've really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to stick around because more videos are about to pop on your screen related to this topic, one of which is about compatibilism. See you next time.